Okay, I think we'll get started. Thank you very much to everyone who is here today for our CPCT research seminar. And a special welcome and thank you to Fadi Bardawil, who is going to lead our seminar today and give us a talk for around 50 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. Just in case you're wondering, so we are recording the seminar at the moment. All participants are in the room but cannot enable their microphone or video. You are very welcome to submit questions during Fadi's talk via the Q&A. But once the official part of the talk is over, we'll open up the floor. You can speak, you can turn on your camera, and you can also write then comments in the chat. So all of that will be enabled after the main talk. My name is Svenja Bromberg, and I am one of the co-directors of the CPCT alongside Julia and Alberto. And I'm also really grateful to Sultan, who initiated this seminar today with Fadi, who is also here, and my colleague Chris Law, also from the CPCT. This is the last research seminar of this academic year. It's not the last CPCT event of this year, so please keep an eye on our newsletter and the website and so on for upcoming events during May and June. But for our research seminar series under the title, What is Global Critical Theory? Today is kind of the final session of this academic year. And I'm really, really pleased to introduce Fadi Bardawil, who is based at Princeton as a visiting research scholar in the Department of Near Eastern Studies and a visiting associate professor in the Department of Anthropology. Alongside his many publications, I just want to briefly highlight his most recent monograph, Revolution and Disenchantment, Arab Marxism and the Binds of Emancipation, that he published with Duke in 2020, because I think that book offers a lot of answers and provocations to the question of this research seminar, not just what is global critical theory, but also how do we do and not do global critical theory. And I think the book, Revolution and Disenchantment, offers a highly interdisciplinary case of kind of, on the one hand, extensive archival work on the Lebanese Marxist left, and specifically the group Socialist Lebanon in the mid-1960s. And at the same time, Fadi attends really carefully to some meta-theoretical challenges and struggles. For example, that of how to do critical scholarly work in and on the Middle East, because of and despite the relationship to Western imperialism in theory and practice. So I think on the one hand, the book shows us that Marxism itself is far from a Western theory that merely travels to the peripheries. And it also focuses on the challenge of how to handle difference while speaking back to a hegemonic Western discourse, as Fadi formulates it in the epilogue, and kind of demands that critical theory, global critical theory, avoids reducing itself to a mere critique of the West. And secondly, the book also addresses front and center the question of how to negotiate the relationship between theory and practice, and of the practical efficacy of theory. And one short, I think, nicely polemical answer is that this practical efficacy of theory is not going to be answered by a kind of mere theoretical epistemology critique. And instead, Fadi offers us this kind of methodology of a field work in theory in that book. So today, the talk that Fadi is giving to us is on Edward Said. The title is An Inventory of Traces, Palestinian Existence in Edward Said's Early Works. And I'll pass over to you, Fadi.
Thank you very much, Svenja, for the very generous introduction. Thank you for the Center for inviting me. And thank you all for being here. It's an honor and a pleasure to be sharing work which is, I'm still thinking through it. And I'll say a few words about it before I start reading the paper. But first, I would like to, I heard recently about the proposed cuts on many positions at Goldsmith, which is an attack on knowledge production in different departments in the social sciences and other departments. And I would like to extend a word of solidarity with my hosts, with the staff, and with the students of Goldsmith University. The university has been under attack for decades now, but the forces of the market and of politics, as we see in the targeting of the students who are in solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinians in US campuses, as well as in the UK, is being intensified. So a salute to all of you, and thank you so much for extending the invitation. This talk, as I said, is an attempt for me to work out a few questions that have to do with authority and experience that I've been thinking about. And in a way, it's an extension of what Svenja mentioned in her introduction about a few of the themes running in my book, particularly the question of mediation between theory and practice, and the question of thinking critical theoretical production in its relationship to where one is living and how one is, how politics is mediated in one's sort of everyday life, so to speak. So I'll start reading, and unfortunately or fortunately, I don't have any slides. So if I'm reading too fast or too slow, please let me know.
Fadi, quick question. One participant says the volume is a little bit low. Is there any way just?
Sure. I can work through my audio settings. Just give me a second. And
thank you.
Is this better?
Yeah. Yes, it's
okay.
Much.
Perfect. I just hiked my input volume. All right. Yeah, please interrupt me if there are any things of the sort. The Euro-American and mostly diasporic critique of Western knowledges of the non-West's entanglement with imperial power took off in the early 1970s. The pioneering works of Talal Asad and the Hull Reading Group gathered around him, which included figures such as Sami Zubaydah, Roger Owen, and others, opened a critical path which would be considerably widened and altered by the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism in 1978. Despite the fact that it has long been normalized in a Kuhnian sense, this reading practice that focuses on interrogating discursive assumptions and the politics of representation never ran out of steam. In successive geopolitical conjunctures characterized by relentless US imperial interventions and invasions that were buttressed by ideologies of liberation, say the liberation of Afghani women from the Taliban, or the bringing of democracy to Iraqis suffering under a tyrant, this defensive and oppositional practice of criticism constituted a much-needed corrective to both the reifications of Arabic cultures by policy pundits and the enlisting of emancipatory discourses and practices, such as feminism, in military imperial ventures. This critique of the entanglement of both discourses of essentialized difference or universalism with imperial power did not lose its impetus precisely because of the sense of political urgency generated by the conjuncture that propelled it and bestowed upon this theoretical critique its anti-imperialist lettre de noblesse. For those of us who teach in the US and who witness in our everyday lives institutional and personal racist acts of violence against Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians, these critical reading practices that seek to disrupt the reproduction of racist stereotypes, at the very least in the classroom, acquire an added importance. Having said that, what I would like to do in the remainder of this talk is to revisit Said's early texts, very early texts, which inaugurated this modality of critique, focusing on the interrogation of discursive assumptions, and in doing so to tease out from these texts a reading that reckons with Said's Palestinian exilic racial grief. which could be construed retrospectively as one of the main animating drives behind these theoretical labor. In the last pages of Orientalism's introduction, Said wrote, and it's worth quoting him at length, and here I start. My own experiences of these matters are in part what made me write this book. The life of an Arab Palestinian in the West, particularly in America, is disheartening. There exists here an almost unanimous consensus that politically he does not exist, and when it is allowed that he does, it is either as a nuisance or as an Oriental. And this is the key sentence here. The web of racism, cultural stereotypes, political imperialism, dehumanizing ideology, holding in the Arab or the Muslim is very strong indeed. And it is this web which every Palestinian has come to feel as his uniquely punishing destiny. End of quote. Taking my cue from Said, I will, in the remainder of this talk, home in on what he, in the introduction, dubs the personal dimension. My claim is a fairly simple one. In a nutshell, it is that this reading practice that set out to assemble a colonial archive and subject it to critique is more than a practice of metropolitan oppositional criticism, a theoretical speaking back to the West. It was certainly a critical epistemological investigation, but it was also much more. These labors of criticism had therapeutic and political dimensions, themselves tied to ontological questions about existence, in Said's case, about the denial of Palestinian existence. In his first foray into this mode of criticism, his essay on the representation of the Arabs in the US, in the wake of the swift defeat of the Arab armies against Israel in 1967, The Arab Portrayed, published in the Arab-Israeli Confrontation of June 67, An Arab Perspective in 1970, a book edited by Ibrahim Abu-Lughod, the Palestinian political scientist, long-term member of the Palestinian National Council, and Edward Said's friend. Said registers in a melancholy tone the Arab impasse, the fact that they cannot get through and reach the American imagination and Western consciousness more generally. He writes with a melancholic attachment to a world that refuses to see Arabs as human beings. And here I quote, during and after the June War, few things could have been more depressing than the way in which the Arabs were portrayed. End of quote. Said goes on to show how the Israelis were depicted as stalwart individuals and heroes, in contrast to the Arabs who were viewed as mobs of hysterical anonymous men. This very early text is saturated with sentences about the excision of Arabs and Palestinians from the domain of the human. And I cite a few for you. What is most telling about Western consciousness of the Arab is how few ordinary categories of human existence seem applicable to him. Suffering and injustice, it seems, Said writes, can never be his lot. If the Arab occupies space in the mind at all, it is of negative value. He is seen as the disruptor of Israel's continuing existence, or in a larger view, a surmountable obstacle to Israel's creation in 1948. A third quote. At worst, the Arab is conceived as a shadow that dogs the Jew. In that shadow, because Arab and Jew are Semites, can be placed whatever traditional latent mistrust Americans might feel toward the Jew. The Arab becomes simply an observable collection of factual statistics based on rigidly frozen categories of population, climate, trade, and so on, a creature without dimension. I could go on, but here's the last citation which is central to my argument. What is extremely important here is how the official Israeli view of the Arab as a kind of troublesome non-person feeds the common and accepted view of the Arab that's currently held in America. End of quote. The shock of the defeat of the Arab armies against Israel in the summer of '67 was experienced by young Arab intellectuals residing in the world's metropoles through an amplification and intensification of racialization. This experience of racialization and its it is this experience of racialization that drove Said to begin his critical reflections on the question of imperialism and Western consciousness. But it wasn't his alone. In a different national context, and with no direct affiliation to Palestine like Said, Talal Asad would decades later reflect on the importance of the war for him in a conversation with David Scott by saying, "Then came 67 and the 6 Days War. That was an enormous watershed in my life, intellectually as well as politically. The first thing was the reaction of the English, which astounded me. I couldn't get over the fantastic delight at the utter defeat of Egypt and other Arab countries. Joy expressed in TV and newspaper reports and in photographs, I still have some of these, at the thousands of humiliated, exhausted peasant soldiers forced to walk barefoot over the hot desert. I could understand the joy that Israelis must have felt at their victory," Assad says. But the English? What was the emotion that fueled the exaltation of this enlightened nation towards the ignominious defeat of a wretched, oppressed Oriental people? This question, he adds, began as a rhetorical one for me, as a reproach, but slowly it pushed me to rethink the assumptions I had for so long carried with me about rationality and justice in politics. End of quote. The Egyptian-born professor of women's studies at Harvard Divinity School and feminist scholar Layla Ahmad revisited in her memoir the racism she experienced in Britain as well in the 60s. She writes, "And then too, there was the 67 Arab-Israeli War, which unleashed in the press a deluge of frenetic, ignorant, biased, and outright racist views of Arabs." Before continuing a couple of paragraphs later, "I hated Nasser, the Egyptian president at the time, but I knew that what they were saying about him was imperialist, racist rubbish, and the flagrant heartlessness and injustice with which the British press often wrote of the Palestinians was also perfectly plain to me." End of quote. The difference in the national context between England and the US notwithstanding, what Assad and Ahmad's recollections and Said's text make clear is the affective and ideological identifications of the metropoles with Israel during the war. In Said's case, though, it's explicitly articulated in his observation about how the excision of the Arab from the domain of being in America corresponds to the Zionist denial of Palestinian existence. The war creates an internal wedge between what they believed in and the societies they lived in, on the one hand, and with what they just experienced firsthand. Something which will be construed later on by Assad as a watershed and by Said as a turning point. Wartime itself is the experience of the extension and amplification of a racializing gaze against Arabs in popular culture, political magazines, everyday news commentary, newspapers. In brief, it cuts across ideological lines and across registers of cultural production, hence the claustrophobic sense of existential impasse, which will be rendered in Orientalism as the uniquely punishing destiny of the Palestinian. These seismic affective experiences resonate with what Ghassan Haj, in his reading of Frantz Fanon, calls the affective politics of racial misinterpretation, which work according to a drama in two acts. Here I quote from Haj. "In the first instance, the racialized person is interpolated as belonging to a collectivity, like everybody else. He or she are hailed by the cultural group or the nation, or even by modernity, which claims to be addressing everyone. And the yet to be racialized person believes that the hailing is for everyone and answers the call thinking that there is a place for him or her awaiting to be occupied. Yet no sooner do they answer the call and claim their spot than the symbolic order brutally reminds them that they are not part of everyone. No, I wasn't talking to you, piss off, you are not part of us." This, for Ghassan Haj, is the core of the Fanonian racial drama. Fanon hears the European call of the universal, and everything in him makes him believe that the call is directed to him. He therefore answers the call, only to find out that the call was not really addressed to him. End of quote. What interests me in is how the experience of the 67 war is mediated in the metropole in Said's experience through the singularity of his Palestinian past, so to speak. It produces a moment, the moment of wartime racialization produces a telescoping of times and spaces, vividly bringing back to Said's mind the years preceding the Palestinian Nakba of 48. If the Arab, I cite again, if the Arab occupies space in the mind at all, it is of negative value. He is seen as the disruptor of Israel's continuing existence, or in a larger view, a surmountable obstacle to Israel's creation in 1948. This has been, Said adds, of course, part of the Zionist attitude toward the Arab, especially in the years before 48, when Israel was being promulgated ideologically. Palestine, he adds, was imagined as an empty desert waiting to burst into bloom, its inhabitants imagined as inconsequential nomads possessing no stable claim to the land, and therefore no cultural permanence. End of quote. A few years later, in Arab and Jews, an essay also written in the context of another war, the Arab-Israeli War of October 73, for an edited volume titled Settler Regimes in Africa and the Arab World, The Illusion of Endurance. Said revisits and develops the themes first sketched in the first essay, namely the weightlessness of Palestinian existence for the world. He writes, for the Palestinians, perforce, his national identity is an embattled resistance to dispossession and extinction. Yet, for most of the world, he has seemed like cigarette ash, moved from corner to corner, threatened away always with irreversible dispersion. End of quote. He also continues with the motif of the displacement of Western anti-Semitic animus on the figure of the Arab, mentioned earlier. All Arabs, he writes, have suffered both in the Middle East and in the West, and goes on to note that the Jew of pre-Nazi Europe has split into two, a Jewish hero constructed out of a revived cult of the adventurer pioneer, and the Arab, his creeping, mysterious, fearsome shadow. Thus, isolated from his past, the Arab has seemed to be condemned to provide local color, to be chastised at the hands of Israeli soldiers and tourists, to be kept in his place by American phantom jets, American cluster bombs, and napalm and UJA money. End of quote. At this point, Said's text stops abruptly to move unexpectedly and in a single paragraph break from cluster bombs and napalm to an even more distant past than the pre-Nakba time, one that even precedes modernity, the Christian Middle Ages. To note that Arabs and Islam, and I quote here, have always been a singular problem for the largely Christian West, end of quote. In doing so, Said is fast to warn his readers that the present-day political dealings between the West Arabs and Israelis are not to be grasped via recourse to medieval doctrinal problems. Having said that, the unexpected and unmediated leap from napalm bombs to the Middle Ages does two things for him. First, it's to point to a time when Judaism and Islam were considered together as more or less interchangeable problems from the perspective of the Christian West. And more importantly, it's to note in part that it's this background which illuminates the commonly accepted view of the Arabs that's found in the West today. If in the first texts, the Arabs' inexistence in Western consciousness recalls the Zionist erasure of Palestinians, in the second, the Arabs qua shadow, today's target of Western anti-Semitism, goes back in time much further to point to how today's racism cannot be dissociated from the Arab-Muslim problem for the West. It's difficult to resist framing these early essays through a Du Boisian lens. The double consciousness of the Palestinians, their two-ness and second sight. They know they are resisting their extinction, and they know that for the rest of the world, they have the ontological weight of cigarette ash. And of course, the Arabs, Muslims as constituting a singular problem for the West. For readers of Orientalism, which will be published 5 years later and dedicated to Brahim Abul-Lughul, the editor of the 2 volumes, and his partner at the time, the sociologist and urban studies scholar Janet Lipman, these themes may seem familiar. So why am I revisiting them today? Well, in part, I think it's to recenter the question of Palestine to what has been read as the founding text of post-colonial studies, or more precisely, to provide a genealogy of the re-emergence of the question of Palestine for Said as a political and conceptual question in the context of metropolitan wartime racialization. Okay, so I've shown that, but does it matter? I do think it does, because it helps us to think about rereading Said's calling into question of the authority of Orientalist discourses less as a detached theoretical enterprise of epistemology critique about representations, and more as articulating a language to apprehend the Arab Muslim Palestinian exilic diasporic experience as a result of a moment of racial grief and existential impasse. One that's produced by the explicit intensification and extension of a racializing gaze in the US, and that in doing so ties metropole and periphery, exile and home, past and present together. Orientalism, so to speak, as an exploration of the lived experience of the Arab in the West, and as a result, the act of energetically constituting in the span of a few years, from a non-disciplinary position, an Orientalist archive, one which weds the racializing gaze to authoritative discourses, and which resonates with what Frantz Fanon calls in Black Skin, White Masks, a historical racial schema. And here I'm indebted to the interpretation of that schema by the phenomenologist philosopher Ali al-Saji, who mentions, and I quote al-Saji's work, whereas prior to his interpolation as Black, Fanon could imagine all civilizational history as his own, he was now limited to those historical elements that made up a stereotyped Black past. Thus, he says, my eardrums were bursting with cannibalism, mental retardation, fetishism, racial taints, slave traders, and abavia bombalania. History, in other words, has been naturalized. The past is no longer lived at a distance as past, but is experienced as overdetermining and proximate, stuck and sticky dimension of the present. End of quote. In other words, what I'm trying to do is to reread Orientalism and Said's trilogy overall, Orientalism, The Question of Palestine, which was published a year afterwards, and Covering Islam, as a critical theory that is reckoning with the historical racial schema in the wake of the moment of interpolation that's constituted by the experience of the 67 war in the metropole and its aftermath, the moment which drives a wedge between the subject and his everyday experiences in exile. Orientalism, Layla Ahmad wrote in her memoir, gave us, amongst many other things, a language with which to begin to talk of some aspects of the experience of being Arab. Most particularly, it gave us a way to speak of being Arab in the West and of what it was to live embattled in a sea of prejudices that came to us as, between scare quotes, knowledge, objective, neutral, transcendent, unbiased truth, end of quote. This displacement of the angle of the reading of Orientalism enables me to evade certain questions that historians may debate on whether Arabs and Muslims constituted a singular problem for the West, and whether Said is reifying both East and West, as he was accused of doing, by looking at Orientalism less as a work which charts the historical relations between East and West, and more as an attempt to grapple with the lived experience of the Palestinian Arab Muslim more generally, an attempt to come to terms with both an existential racial grief, racialized fragmented time, and a political impasse that forecloses the possibility of solidarity with the Palestinians and Arabs more generally. It's also a reading that seeks to bracket the scholarly Orientalist critique of Said's omission of certain Orientalist traditions, like the German one, and whether including those would alter his argument. In doing so, I'm also consciously reinserting Orientalism into the larger questions that animated Said's trilogy, in order to disturb for a minute, singling it out as the work of theory, an honor that was never bestowed on the question of Palestine and Covering Islam. And in doing so, bracketing its reading alongside the other important works of American theory of the 70s, dealing with the question of representation and the cultural turn in the humanities. And here I have in mind Harry Haratunian's insightful reading of Said, which I'll come back to later, which places Orientalism alongside Hayden White's Meta-History in 1973 and Frederick Jameson's Political Unconscious in 1981. 3 books, Haritunian writes, published within 8 years of each other, which vocalized in their own way the conjuncture's embrace of culture. And last but not least, I'm after circumventing being bogged down by either upholding Said's comments on Marx's Orientalism and its rebuttals by prominent Arab Marxists like the late Syrian philosopher and public intellectual Sadiq Jalal al-Azam, the assassinated Lebanese Althusarian theorist Mehdi Amil, and the late Indian-American theorist Ijaz Ahmad. Why so? Because I think thinking Orientalism from this particular angle, one that is reckoning with the intimate relation between the erasure of Palestinians at home by Zionists and racialized time in the metropoles, of the past as overdetermining and proximate, stuck and sticky dimension of the present, enables me to understand how Said moves from napalm bombs to medieval anti-Muslim rhetoric in one paragraph, bypassing the whole debate on the question of modernity, the breaks that accompanied it, and the age of progress it ushered, something he was criticized for. Let me take you through a quick detour that will hopefully make my point clearer via Al-Azam's defense of Marx from the charge of Orientalism. Marx's views on British rule in India and Said's work were put to work to reveal how a non-Orientalist's writings on Asia first reveal his humanity and fellow feeling. These are concepts by Said, humanity and fellow feeling, before being hijacked thereafter by Orientalist discourses, when Marx posits that the British destroyer is also the creator of a new modern society. The idea of regenerating a fundamentally lifeless Asia, wrote Said, is a piece of pure or romantic Orientalism. Marx's humanity has succumbed in Said's reading to the unshakable definitions built up by Orientalist science. Al-Azm's tone in his defense of Marx is quite harsh. I think that this account of Marx's views and analysis of highly complex historical processes and situations is a travesty. Marx's manner of analyzing British rule in India in terms of an unconscious tool of history, Al-Azm adds, which was making possible a real social revolution by destroying the old India and laying the foundations of a new order, cannot be ascribed under any circumstances to the usurpation of Marx's mind by conventional Orientalistic verbiage. Marx's explanation, regardless of whether one agrees or disagrees with him, testifies to his theoretical consistency in general. Like the European capitalist class, British rule in India was its own gravedigger. There's nothing particularly Orientalistic about this explanation. Furthermore, Marx's call for a revolution in Asia is more historically realistic and promising than any noble sentiments that he could have lavished on vanishing socioeconomic formations. End of quote. As you can see, Al-Azm's strategy of defense lay in reinscribing Marx's view on Asia within his overall historicist framework, undoing in the process any essentialization of East and West as a product of Orientalism's ahistorical bourgeois bent of mind. Marx, wrote Al-Azm, like anyone else, knew of the superiority of modern Europe over the Orient, but to accuse a radically historicist thinker such as Marx of turning this contingent fact into a necessary reality for all time is simply absurd. End of quote. Al-Azm plays historicism against ontology to save Marx from the charge of Orientalism. But Said's argument in the book is targeted against both. And it's not because he's an anti-modern who has a blanket condemnation of progress, far from it. It's rather because he's very much aware of how culturalist and historicist arguments can be marshaled to eliminate the native and justify the establishment of a settler society. Both are part of the historical racial schema that becomes explicit in the wake of 67. In other words, the British regeneration of a fundamentally lifeless Asia could be looked at from the perspective of Al-Azm as the weak chain in the dialectic that will result in a global social revolution in India, during which British rule was like the bourgeoisie unwittingly acting as its own gravedigger, or it can be looked at from the perspective of the Zionist colonization of Palestine, where progress and labor justified and ennobled the act of settlement, something which is not part of any dialectical process of progress, at least not for the indigenous Palestinian. And this is in fact how Said looked at it. In the Question of Palestine, he touches again on Marx's views in passing as he critically engages an article by the famous Christian theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, an article titled A New View of Palestine, published on August 6, 1946. Said notes that Niebuhr's real intention is nothing more than saying that whether they have an opinion or not, Arabs ought not to be allowed to obstruct the technical and dynamic civilization being brought into Palestine by the Jews, end of quote. And goes on to add that what he, i.e. Niebuhr, does not see as Marx did not see 100 years earlier when he wrote about the British in India, is that there was a national right being violated even by a technical and dynamic civilization when it made its colonial incursions upon the miserable masses. These are in quotes. So while Al-Azm was defending a progressive view of history and trying to salvage Marx, the aim of Said's critique, as we just saw, was early on calling into question the multiple logics of justification of the elimination of the natives from their lands. It's a native critique, not one that relies on native cosmology, but one that's spoken from the standpoint of the native. Or rather, it is that standpoint which enables him to see how such intellectual frameworks are not only theories of progress and emancipation as they are for Al-Azm, but could be marshaled as practical systems, to use his own words in the description of Zionism, for the displacement of the native and the accumulation of their lands. At the heart of Said's critique of the authority of discourses, then, is a recognition of how they dignify colonial conquest, a theme which was dear to his early intellectual companion Joseph Conrad, which he draws again in the Question of Palestine, citing this passage from him, i.e. Conrad, and here I'm citing. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only, an idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to, end of quote. This is one way through which we can understand what Said meant by his condensation of the struggle between Palestinians and Zionism as a struggle between a presence and an interpretation, the former constantly appearing to be overpowered and eradicated by the latter. What was this presence, he asked? No matter how backward, uncivilized, and silent they were, the Palestinian Arabs were on the land, end of quote. Backward, uncivilized, and silent. With these three words, let's move back one more time to Orientalism and see how does Said go about investigating the historical racial schema that began imposing itself on him with the shattering moment of 67. One which led both to an intense experience of racialization and to the explicit recovery of his Palestinianness. In his memoir, Out of Place, he characterized the shattering impact of the war in a parallel manner to the telescoping of times and spaces that the emergence of the schema enacted in the wake of his racialization. And here I cite from him. And 67 brought more dislocations, whereas for me it seemed to embody the dislocation that subsumed all other losses, the disappeared worlds of my youth and upbringing, the unpolitical years of my education, the assumption of disengaged teaching and scholarship at Columbia, and so on. I was no longer the same person after 67. The shock of that war drove me back to where it all started, the struggle over Palestine. I subsequently entered the newly transformed Middle Eastern landscape as part of the Palestinian movement that emerged in Amman and then in Beirut in the late 60s through the 70s. End of quote. Said casts the critical investigation of that schema as an exercise in self-knowledge. Let me quote again one more time at length a passage from the introduction of Orientalism where he fleshes out what he dubs the personal dimension of his project. In the prison notebooks, Gramsci says, Said writes, that the starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is and is knowing thyself as a product of the historical process to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory, end of quote. The only available English translation inexplicably leaves Gramsci's comment at that, whereas in fact Gramsci's Italian text concludes by adding Said's notes. Therefore, it's imperative at the outset to compile such an inventory. Much of the personal investment in this study, that he goes on to say, derives from my awareness of being an Oriental. As a child growing up in two British colonies, all of my education in those colonies, Palestine and Egypt, and in the US, has been Western. And yet, that deep early awareness has persisted. In many ways, my study of Orientalism has been an attempt to inventory the traces upon me, the Oriental subject, of the culture whose domination has been so powerful a factor in the life of all Orientals. To compile an inventory of the infinity of the traces that constitute the self is an activity that entails an articulation of a fashioning of a form out of a multiplicity and heterogeneity of fragmentary traces by framing them, organizing them in order to make a new self, which is nothing but the old self, which had become aware of the multiple forces out of which it was fashioned. This practice of self-knowledge, like Freudian psychoanalysis, has an emancipatory aspect. The critical awareness of those constitutive traces is a first step to neutralize their grip. But diving into the multiple sedimented layers of the inexhaustible Orientalist archive, while making a strong case for its repetition in the present from philology to area studies, and rendering visible the patterns of its entanglement with power, Said's text hopes to contribute to undoing their hold not only over disciplines, but also over colonial and post-colonial subjects. Note, though, as I mentioned earlier, that Said is not simply critically exploring a ready-made archive of Orientalism. His critical practice is, as I mentioned, also constitutive of this archive. His book births it by juxtaposing and showing the common assumptions undergirding works from various theoretical traditions and disciplinary formations. Islamic studies, area studies, fiction, nonfiction, that span over, at span of time over more than 2 centuries. The labors of autoanalysis are constitutive of an archive of discourse, which is examined psychoanalytically by Said, who is able to do so because he posits the West as a subject, whose sovereign consciousness produces these works. Additionally, he writes, the imaginative examination of things Oriental was based more or less exclusively upon a sovereign Western consciousness, out of whose unchallenged centrality an Oriental world emerged, first according to general ideas about who or what was an Oriental, then according to a detailed logic governed not simply by empirical reality, but by a battery of desires, repressions, investments, and projections. End of quote. He goes on to note how great works of scholarships like Edward Lane's Racial Ideas, Gobineau, and Victorian pornographic novels came out of the same impulse. Here, like in the early text on the representation of the Arabs, the Orientalist racist drive unites different registers of culture and authors of different ideological persuasions. Having said that, this experience of self-knowledge, unlike, say, the psychoanalytic setting, where the analyst listens to the analysant, involves an inversion of that configuration, a reversal of roles. It is the Oriental now who gets to know himself by listening to the Orientalist. And it is a peculiar form of listening, one that takes place behind the Orientalist's back. One could call it a self-knowledge gained through something akin to an anti-colonial infiltration operation. Nearly 2 decades after the book's first publication, Said revisits the reception of the work and rearticulates its positions. In a moment of self-disclosure probably facilitated by the radical transformation the book effected on disciplinary landscapes, he writes about Orientalists, and I quote again, I must confess to a certain pleasure in listening in uninvited to their various pronouncements and inter-Orientalist discussions, and an equal pleasure in making known my findings to both Europeans and non-Europeans. I have no doubt that this was made possible because I traversed the imperial East-West divide, entered into the life of the West, and yet retained some organic connection with the place I originally came from. End of quote. The transformation in the racial demographics of the metropolitan academic body disturbed the strict linguistic, institutional, and geographical boundaries, separating the objects of inquiry from its subjects. This was not a seamless process. The young men and women who headed west from the colonial world to study confronted racist and misogynistic attitudes and texts, which were endowed with the authority of objective knowledge, science, and the universal. The critical languages on the relationships of knowledge to power had yet to be articulated. Layla Ahmed's experience, which I cited earlier, recounts her time at the University of Cambridge in the 1960s, poignantly registers the fundamental disconnect between, on the one hand, the personal experiences of students from the colonial world and the suffering accompanied them, and on the other, the structures of academic labor and the white male canon. Note, though, that Said's upbeat tone in the afterword of 1994 is very different from the racial grief suffusing the early texts and even the introduction to Orientalism. Said's perverse double pleasure, first eavesdropping and second divulging, says a lot about the psychoaffective drive propelling his infiltration operation into Orientalist lines to leak, expose, and undermine. The critical gesture of the leaking eavesdropper bears the structural similarities to the practice of fadah in Arabic, exposing, making a scene, shaming, causing a scandal, which the scholar of Arabic literature Tara al-Aris has recently analyzed and brought to bear on Orientalism. What Said was after in his critique of Orientalism, al-Aris observes, was hacking it and leaking out its manuals and codes and making a scene out of its fantasies. Gramsci's traces in Said's account, though, lose their anonymous palimpsestic quality, the result of the accumulations of layers and layers from all past phases of history, to become the inscriptions of a singular author, the West, which renders them imbricated at least since the age of imperial expansion and an anti-colonial antagonism. This imbrication of the labors of interpretation and self-knowledge within an anti-colonial matrix produces the peculiar tension at the heart of Said's texts, which can be described as an anti-colonial hermeneutics of the self, which is neither an anti-colonial culture or a decolonial culture, nor an anti-colonial politics, nor is it a theory of anti-colonial practice. The initially depressed Palestinian turned eavesdropper sets about to tally the colonial traces which constituted him, and in doing so seeks to undermine the authority of the discourses depositing those traces. He produces an interpretation of oneself which doubles as oppositional critique, as a speaking back to the West, of the object of discourse becoming its subject. Orientalism then exhibits a tension between its anti-colonial gesture of reversal, or the notion of criticism as a weapon, and oppositional speaking back to the West, and of criticism as an act of compiling an inventory of oneself in the hopes of gaining self-knowledge. It's a tension between the oppositional binary political structure of East-West, self-other, dominated, dominant, and the infinity of traces that constituted the subject that needs to be organized and cataloged. Having said that, the question that could perhaps have resolved that tension and which Said left hanging is the question of the subject. So we've compiled the inventory of traces and became aware of all the discourses which constituted us, and in doing so obliterated us. What is it that we have to do now? On which basis do we reconstitute ourselves? This practice of self-knowledge in Said does not entail an act of decolonization, or a call for a cure that seeks to recover an authentic self, purged from the colonial influence that divided and alienated it. For instance, some Lebanese and Palestinian Maoist militant intellectuals converted to Islamist politics in the wake of the Iranian Revolution around the time of Orientalism's publication, and for some, this entailed a personal religious conversion. Some, such as Roja Assaf and Munir Shafiq, were born into Christian families and converted with the revolution. They were also critical of the cultural domination of the West, but their critique of the multifaceted dimensions of imperialism entailed a conversion that inscribed them in a thick nativist ideological universe. Or take, for instance, the position of the contemporary Egyptian Islamic thinker, Safinas Kazem, who diagnosed society and self as suffering from schizophrenia, infisam. In her famous essay on prison and freedom, Ellen McLarney writes that Cosm describes a schizophrenia of the self as split between her religious and secular identities that she struggles to close. This concept, schizophrenia, Ellen McLarney observed, was borrowed from Cosm by her friend Muhammad Jalal Kishk, who retrospectively diagnosed Qasim Amin, the lawyer and author of On the Liberation of Women, 1899, as suffering from it. To conclude, when Gramsci wrote, the starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is, and is knowing thyself as a product of the historical process to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces, without leaving an inventory. His concern was not interpretative and therapeutic, but political. As the editor to the Gramsci Reader puts it, the problem that concerns Gramsci is how to overcome the gap separating between Marxism as a philosophy and people's actual consciousness, in order to found a new common sense that will transform people's conceptions of the world and conduct. Said marshaled Gramsci's notion of hegemony to show how culture could be part and parcel of the apparatus of imperial domination. Yet, as Harry Haratunian has insightfully observed, his own devotion to European high culture and separation from his anti-colonial politics of national independence produced, and here I'm citing Haratunian, a curious coupling that could only collide with Gramsci's understanding of culture and politics. It was, after all, Gramsci who early saw the affiliation between forms of cultural expression and political action, and who subsequently envisaged a program devoted to figuring cultural production as a mode of political struggle. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me, let's have a round of applause. And I will quickly change the administration here. If there are questions, I would say, I hope everyone can raise their hand. I've already seen a raised hand just now, but it's gone away again. So yeah, let's take a moment. Let's sink it in, and then hopefully you can raise your hand, or you can now write in the chat. Everyone should be able to write in the chat if you didn't want to write in the Q&A. And if you raise your hand and you want to speak, then you can also be unmuted and turn on your video if you like. I had a couple of questions already sent to me. I wonder if they are good to start us off. Fadi, how do you like us to do it? Should we collect a few questions together or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever. I defer to you. Whatever is good. You have the questions in front of you.
Okay. So whilst we give some time to everyone if they want to write questions or raise their hand, I think I'll start with the ones that have been sent to me already by Mariam Menawi. So some questions: are the today's Orientalism goals different from before? Who supports Orientalism? Should the East be afraid of Orientalism? And what cultures or ethnics do Orientalism focus on more than others? Actually, shall I post them in the chat so they're actually written down? It's quite a lot.
Yes.
Let me quickly do that. Okay, now they're in the chat. So we have those. Are there any other questions? Sultan.
Yeah, happy to add a question since I have to really go sharp at 5:30. Thank you so much, Fadi, for this beautiful talk. Listening to you, several things came up for me. Doing this project, doing this rereading of Orientalism now, in a time of genocide in Gaza. And I know you've been working on this for longer, but like, where do you see the urgency of rereading Said and revisiting Orientalism. And the other thing that I found really fascinating, I think you brought this really well to bear on the question of the figure of the Arab as this disruptor, as both like kind of caught in these epistemologies as like Arab, as perhaps not perhaps racialized, but kind of like Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, all these like different layers of racialization that go into this figure. How do you see this figure work for critical theory? Like, what is the work this does? What kind of effect does this have on a kind of Western conceived notion of critical theory? And I think you kind of showed us, moments of a kind of critically engaging and taking issue with certain hegemonic notions, right, that come out of Said's writing. But what else is it that you want to do with that, with this figure? Like, how do you see this, productive in thinking critical theory more broadly, kind of opening it up, having a broader political horizon?
Right. Shall I attempt to answer? All right. Thank you. Thank you, the first question, and thank you, Sultan. Let me start by Sultan's attempt to answer Sultan's very provocative and important questions. Part of what I'm doing here, and you're right, it's part of something I've been thinking about for a while after I finished the first book, which is really trying to think about this generation of diasporic intellectuals like Tamal Asad, Edward Said, and Layla Ahmed, and to think of their contributions that in a way have become canonical or normalized in a Kuhnian sense to bring back a sort of sense of unfamiliarity, so to speak, to return to the beginnings and not to, for example, peg Said as the theorist that's associated with secular humanism, either to celebrate him or to dismiss him. So I wanted to engage in this kind of labor of rereading to get a sense of how is it that these questions emerged for them. Of course, in the back of my mind was the question of the present today and what this is a very, very sort of preliminary work, so to speak. And once I do this rereading, I would ask the question of, all right, what is it about the travail of this generation of intellectuals that I think will help us, or we need to reactivate to understand our present, and what is it that we think is we need to sort of move away from? So in the question of Said, what I was always interested in, which is basically what I didn't say, but the backbone of this paper, is how can we think of Said as a phenomenologist of Palestinian experience, so to speak, and of the sort of lived experience, the lived exilic experience. So as opposed to just thinking of Orientalism as the founding text of post-colonial studies. In fact, it's morely sort of thinking of Orientalism as precisely that bridge between an anti-colonial politics of sorts and a work that sort of anti-colonial Ministers have to do on themselves when they engage in struggle, which is that idea of the inventory of traces, to sort of move away from it. The figure that I'm interested in is not the figure of the Arab. The figure I'm interested in, I don't know what to do with it, is the figure of the Oriental, because the figure of the Oriental is a figure that Said himself ushers. And if you look at the quotes I've been working with, it's the Arab, the Muslim, the Palestinian, and they all slide. Because if you're looking not from a metropolitan perspective, if you're looking from the perspective of someone in Palestine or in Beirut, there's no sliding between the Arab, the Muslim, and the Palestinian. There are distinctions internal to these categories as well. But I think, which is why what was important for me is not to talk about like Palestinian diaspora or exile, but rather what's important for me is the metropolitan exilic condition, that which basically that figure is ushered there as that moment, as the result of that moment of racial grief, I think. the Oriental, which could be the Palestinian and or the Arab or the Muslim. And what do we do with this? What do we do with this figure? I mean, Fanon is in the back of my mind, of course, in thinking about the question of le noir in masque blanc, in black skin white masks. But the Oriental, I think, does something different. The urgency of working with Said today and with the moves that sort of Said does is a big question that I'm working. I mean, of course, like recovering all of this archive, this sentence about the Palestinian, like cigarette ash moved from one corner to another, I mean, acquires a very, very different meaning today for someone like me working with it. But at the same time, Said's impasse seems to me to be something which one needs to sort of reconsider in terms of like who are you speaking to, and whether Said's work, which could be sort of constituted as a work of cultural diplomacy of sort, and I say this in a very noble way, not in a pejorative way, in a way of explaining to the West what Palestine is about. Whether that move, I think, is the move that's worth doing now, as opposed to sort of rethinking where is one speaking for and whom is one speaking for. But of course, in doing that, one has to acknowledge that in having the luxury to say, I'm not necessarily speaking to you to convince you of the justice of this cause, so to speak, one has to acknowledge that that rests on the labor of what people like Said did 50 years ago. The fact that they initiated this move of saying, because one of the things that Said repeats in the question of Palestine and in Orientalism is that the Palestinian has no ground to stand on, and his work is to basically open up that ground. He's either collapsed into the figure of the terrorist or the figure of the anti-Semite. And how do you open a clearing for the question of Palestine to emerge, which is not, always already sort of collapsed into either the figure of the anti-Semite or the figure of the terrorist? These are the questions that he was dealing with in the 70s, and in which he does this, what I call this moment of anti-colonial infiltration, which is basically to sort of eavesdrop on these conversations and reframe them critically. It's the same move that he does in Orientalism and that he does in the question of Palestine in the central essay of that book called Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Victims, which is a move of eavesdropping on how basically Zionist theorists and ideologues are talking about the Palestinian, and sort of flipping that over and trying to think through what does this what do these discourses entail from the perspective of those who were never entailed to be a subject in conversations, but rather objects of policy or something else. I mean, the question of critical theory for me is I don't have a fast answer for it, but for a long time I've been trying to sort of do this kind of work of friction, like reading, reading the sort of Lebanese and Palestinian Marxists with Said, or reading Césaire with Adorno, in order to sort of displace and rethink what is thought to be critical theory, so to speak, and to sort of that's one way, but I don't think it's only that. So I'm not only interested in sort of like a critique of, saying that, Frankfurt School, for example, were Eurocentric or something like that, but rather in terms of maybe shifting questions as well, and trying to think about not necessarily sort of like widening whatever is considered to be critical theory. This is a move that Susan Buck-Morss does in a few of her essays, when she says, let's publish Ali Shariati, for example, or someone like that in versus radical theory, versus radical thinkers sort of series. But I do have an attachment to sort of to thinking the core of what do we understand by theory and what do we understand by emancipation. And this is how I play with these questions, is to like think sort of this question of sort of emancipation from one hand and theory from the other hand, which is why I keep on going back to this Marx and Said and the sort of Arab Marxists from different perspectives, because I'm trying to sort of like open up how is it that for our world, what constitutes an emancipatory move for some may be considered power for others. And I keep on thinking these together, because at the end of the day, what I'm interested in is how do we think through this world, which is very interconnected yet fragmented at the same time, this paradox of our present, which is we're more and more interconnected via capital, via migrations, via sort of technologies, but at the same time, we have things are much more fragmented. I think I talked a lot. Let me try and answer a few of the big questions. In the first question, I'm not sure if I can sort of answer the big questions that were asked of me first. I mean, part of what I was trying to do is not to think of Orientalism as an instrument or a weapon, but rather to try and think through Orientalism, so to speak, as a historical racial schema, as part of an archive that could include anything from scholarly works to Victorian pornographic novels, like Said talks about, in which one is sort of caught in its web, so that to think about the goals and like the sort of like who supports it, whether there's like an agent afterwards, is hard for me to think through it. I mean, you know, Harry Haratunian in his sort of reading of Said gestures to the fact that the notion of a unified West that Said operates with in Orientalism is taken from Said's interest in in Auerbach, in Mimesis. So he takes that notion of a unified West from Auerbach's and sort of takes it, and it becomes the sort of the subject of Orientalism. And that's something I really need to sort of think through more. How is it that what I'm doing in terms of doing this phenomenological reading of Said through Ali Assaji's work on Fanon fits with that, with Haratunian's reading. But let me stop here. Sorry,
No, thank you so much. So there is a question by Connor in the Q&A, and then a follow-up question also by Connor, I think, in the chat. So let me just read both, and then we'll have Alberto. So Connor's question is, Said often said in interviews that he was stung into writing by June 1967, but the book that emerged arguably and at least chronologically from that was Beginnings, not Orientalism. Is it possible to fit Beginnings, Said's most densely theoretical text, into the framework which, Fadi, you've set out for us? And then a follow-up comment, I was just going to refer to Zionism from the standpoint of its victims. Now we can see Orientalism as Orientalism from the standpoint of the Orientals, a kind of counter-memory. So that's the first question comment.
yes. It's yes to both questions. Do you want to go on, or should I like?
No, you go.
Yeah, you know, Beginnings is a very, very interesting book and a very difficult book. I think it's one of and a very ambitious book. In a few lines in the intro to Orientalism, Said mentions that basically he laid out the methodology to that book in his previous book, which is Beginnings. And you're right, the Beginnings, so to speak, started in the late 60s. And the project of thinking through Beginnings started then, and I think these two projects sort of moved in parallel, Beginnings and what became Orientalism. But Beginnings is definitely the methodology that's laid out in Beginnings is what informs in a large part Orientalism and the question of Palestine. That when he talks about studying texts genealogically and practically in the Question of Palestine. This is in the beginning. There's also something else, which is Said's interest in the question of experience, which is at the heart of beginnings, which I didn't sort of develop now, but it's something I'm very interested in. A notion of experience, which is a sort of witness with the world, which, because when he writes the Question of Palestine, he says this is a book which is about the Palestinian experience, which is neither written from an expert's point of view nor from a witness's point of view. So experience is this sort of mezzo concept, phenomenological mezzo concept, which is neither a sort of claiming to write from a position of objective expertise, nor is it simply a subjective act of witnessing. And if you read the Question of Palestine clearly, you realize how sometimes he's speaking about the Palestinian experience, and then at some point he speaks about himself. So that notion of experience is actually central to beginnings. So is the methodology he lays out about how to read discourses and their affiliations. So I mean, another thing that I was trying to do is, in this reading of Orientalism, is to move away from, oh, is Said like is Said a Foucauldian, but like a bad Foucauldian, the Jim Clifford reading, oh, he's a Foucauldian, but he retains like humanist traces in his work. Or is Said someone who basically comes from the genealogy of, Lukács, Adorno, Gramsci, Raymond Williams, the sort of like the culture Marxist sort of tradition. And I mean, the question is, all of these things are there, but I think there's a way to read this project without basically over determining its kind of theoretical reading as it has been done through the question of Foucault, not Foucault, or Marxist, not Marxist enough, which is the kind of readings that have been, and that's what I was trying to move away from in sort of offering this reading. And yes, absolutely, about the sort of about the Connors question. But thank you for the question about beginnings. This is sort of like it's undergirding the reading, but it's not there because and so is the first book, which is a dissertation, which is on Conrad and the fiction of autobiography, which I think is very important as well, and in which the notion of experience in Conrad comes to the fore. And it's partly what I was trying to do, to sort of recenter Conrad, so to speak, in this genealogy as well, in understanding what he was trying to do. Sorry, Alberto?
Yeah, thanks so much, Fadi. That was a really brilliant exploration of Said's work, but also of a lot of themes that are obviously extremely urgent. So I wanted to ask you about that formulation of racial grief, or racial
Right.
grief as experienced in the metropolis. And I was wondering how you saw that articulated with, I suppose, what we could also see as a kind of political grief, or at least a political affect of defeat, right?
Yeah.
And what follows from it, because in a sense, at least in the trajectory, I suppose in the biographical trajectory of Said, at least as he himself recounts it in various interviews, that political grief, the shock of defeat, is very energizing, right?
Absolutely.
And of course, it's also very energizing for the whole transformation of the Palestinian resistance movement. A year after 1967, we have the Battle of Kalameh and the kind of crystallization of the PLO also as a fighting organization as well as a political project, right? And so, but I was also interested, right, because what those experiences mean for the metropolitan diasporic intellectual ensconced often, right, in spaces of, the ideological state apparatus of the imperial power, as is the case today, right? I was really, I was reminded because, you mentioned the cultural diplomacy, and I was recently watching it was a kind of collective debate with Mohammed Al-Kurd, Noura Erakat, and Jihad Abu Salim in I think it was at George Mason University or something like that. And there was an interesting debate between them, all in different ways in this. I mean, of course, Mohammed Al-Kurd is usually, for a long time an activist in East Jerusalem, but he's been in the U.S. for a while now. But it was the discussion about to what extent is the activity of persuasion, pedagogy, and cultural diplomacy addressed to, those who have been suffused with this kind of Orientalist perspective any longer, right? So it was an interesting kind of different, right? Because
which is what I was trying to gesture to. You're
because for some of them it was like, that's over. This is done, because actually the question of there's a question of the politics of knowledge, as we see on US, or the politics in the places of the production of knowledge, as we see on all these campuses in the US and elsewhere, but not a question like that question of the critique of the systems of legitimation for imperial and racist subjection just seems to be very displaced, both in its like intellectual articulation, but also in its politics. I was kind of wondering about how you saw those issues playing out, right? Also, all of this in the context of a complex return to a much more combative discourse that, at least at a distance, would seem to be very much closer to an anti-imperialist discourse of the early 70s or the 60s, right? At least in our current moment. So yeah, it's not a very precise question, but those are at least some of the themes that your talk brought out. Also in thinking, I guess, also about the disanalogies or the ruptures, right, between the trajectory and the moment that you're following in Said and where we're at now.
Right. No, thank you so much. I mean, you're kind of articulating what I was gesturing at about, and on the question of what he calls the impasse, the existential impasse, which is because what Said is thinking about in terms of the question of impasse is a question of epistemology, ontology, and politics. It's like he says at some point, when people like watch the Battle of Algiers, they sort of like that liberal leftist sympathies goes to for example, Algerian resistance, but why isn't that the case when something happens with the Palestinians? This is in one of the texts, and that. Let me go back to it in the beginning. This moment of, let me address the first disjuncture that you mentioned, which is particularly important for me, which is this idea of racial grief in the metropole versus this amalgam of political defeat and revolutionary fervor at home, which is basically if you can even see this if you read Sadr al-Azam, who's basically saying, we were defeated because we were backwards, but there's this hope that's coming, which is the Palestinian revolution. So absolutely, this moment of defeat, in a way, drives this wedge in the everyday life experiences of these people, where they notice that they're like basically racialized and heavily racialized, and from all different corners, and they're very much appalled by the fact that also the left is partaking in that, and the liberals and all of that. But at the same time, which is why I put the quote from Out of Place with these things, it's a moment of invigoration and of basically people getting mobilized in the diaspora or in exile. Said did not like the word diaspora, in exile, to sort of, so to speak, be part of that movement, which is growing. So there is racial grief, and there is the Battle of Karama. Having said that, Said, who was always very, very preoccupied with this question of articulation, what kind of form can you give to the Palestinian experience, could not bring himself, when he was writing the Question of Palestine in the late 70s, to write a romantic form or narrative of liberation. He could not write a Fanonian sort of in itself, for itself, object to subject, sort of like transition that we see in the first chapter, or that's rendered perfectly well in the Battle of Algiers with Ali Lapointe, from like sort of street sort of like thug to a revolutionary. And he articulates this. He says, our history has been tremendous. In the past decade, our history has been tremendous, but at the same time had also faced tremendous setbacks. It's always this ambivalence between basically the breakthroughs that the Palestinians are doing, but also the hurdles. And he says that, 2 years after the Battle of Karama was Black September happened. And then like 5 years after that, you had the sort of like entanglement in the Lebanese civil and regional wars. So he's writing in the late 70s, and he's saying something tremendous happened in terms of like putting Palestine on the world stage again with the Palestinian Revolution, starting in the late 60s. But also we had these, and the reason for that is, he says, is that because we don't have a territory of our own, unlike the Vietnamese. So you're always fighting from either Jordan or from Lebanon. So you get entangled into not only sort of infranational solidarities, but also into the logic of state sovereignty. So a revolution and a state sovereignty. So racial grief and political exhilaration, yes, but also Said's. This is something that comes back often in Said, even in the Permission to Narrate, this amazing article that he writes after the invasion of Beirut in 82, in which, what form do you give to the Palestinian experience? And if you think about the sort of scholarship that has been done about sort of thinking about, rereading anti-colonial history as tragedy or sort of as romance, etc., Said is from the get-go thinking about this Palestinian experience as having all of these elements to it. At one point, he goes back and he thinks the question of Palestine as irony. He says at one point that at the moment where we have a breakthrough in the West and there's much more sympathy with basically the sort of Palestinian cause, there are more Palestinian lands that are lost. So how do you translate? I mean, there's an irony here at this point where like, okay, yeah, there's more and more people who basically, if you want to put it in Gramscian speak, like there's a fracture of the sort of like anti-Zionist or anti-Palestinian hegemony in terms of discourse. It's fractured. But is this leading to sort of like Palestinian emancipation, so to speak, in Palestine? So the question of, I think you put your finger on something that I'm trying to think through with Said, which is, there's something which is very prevalent in Said, which is in Fanon, which is the question of the body, and it's absent in Said in the question of racialization. But there's something which is very, maybe because he was a literature scholar, but there's something about thinking about the form of articulation of a particular experience that he's always struggling with, and the sort of the difficulty of finding a particular form through which that experience, with its highs and lows, that simultaneously, with its ironies, how do you get them? And that's what you put your hand on what you mentioned about that panel is what I was gesturing to, whether basically now the question is very much posed on the table about whether you want to keep on doing that work or whether that work now ought to ought not to be done because there's something else to be done, or you have to speak to other people. And this is a question that has to do with it's a political question about solidarity, but it's also a question about the strategies of how do you encounter racism and whether you negotiate or you believe that, because Said clearly said at a few points, maybe in the question of Palestine, that I believe in rational discourse, which is partly why I'm writing this book. So the politics of knowledge, for me, the question is not about making Palestine visible, but where and how do you do it? Do you want to sort of engage in sort of like a liberal politics, or do you want to sort of like reinscribe Palestine in a constellation of other, for example, anti-normative, anti-racist indigenous struggles? And then when you do that, you're no longer doing that move of cultural diplomacy. It's a different kind of move. It's a move of sort of like finding a different kind of home. But then in doing that, then what does this move sort of open up and foreclose at the same time? I'm personally very much interested in thinking more about these questions, but as you can see from my answer, I'm hesitant to tell you, like, I think this is the way to go, or this is this is not, but I think it's important to recover that move in Said and also recover its limitations. That's what I was pointing out. And limitations that are now being articulated, as you mentioned, in that panel as well.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am looking a little bit at the time and thinking we might have space for if there is any final urgent question. Is there anyone who was waiting to speak? Please tell me now. Otherwise, we might also draw the official seminar to a close. I just want to say thank you as well for this rich talk. I had a kind of small thought about what without kind of, or by bypassing, which I very much kind of understand, this attempt to, Marxify or demarxify Said, or read, how much Foucault is in Said, and these kinds of questions. I thought it was actually really interesting how you articulated this kind of anti-colonial hermeneutics of the self, and there, for me, kind of, you did something interesting there with that Foucauldian notion to show the kind of different dimensions of Said's work around this kind of the personal, experiential, phenomenological, but then kind of, so I'm still thinking through the kind of the anti-colonial hermeneutics of the self. To me, it kind of politicizes that notion in much in a much richer way, in a way than I've been finding in Foucault, a little bit limited. So that's, I think, also a nice reversal, maybe. I don't know.
Thank you. I'm interested in its limitations. I mean, that's partly why
as well.
I'm pushing myself into thinking, like, again, in my answer to Alberto, is that, like, what is it that he leaves us with, and what is it that we need to sort of refigure? But thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fadi. Thank you, everyone in the audience. There are lots of thank yous as well in the chat. Thanks so much for coming to the seminar. For everyone who is in London, the next CPCT event is an in-person event on the 3rd of May. Julia, do you want? Oh yeah, you put it in the chat. Perfect. So you find the next two events, Chinese Modernity and German Jewish Thought, on the 3rd of May, and then 7th and 8th of May, the annual lecture with Linda Martin Alcoff, also in London, also in person. In the chat, thanks very much, and hopefully see you soon. And thank you, Fadi.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.